Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. With me today is Melissa D. White, and she is an international speaker, coach, and advocate. And she's the founder of the Activation Hour and Righting Our Wrongs. And you can find her at melissadwhite.com and on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Melissa D. White. Melissa, thank you for joining me.
Hi, John. You know I'm excited to see you always.
Yeah, likewise. We should maybe tell people how we met, huh?
That would
Because,
help.
yeah. So how about you tell the story and I'll fill in pieces.
Yeah. So we had an amazing connection by both traveling to the other side of the world and
That's right.
connecting to be part of a group of 20 dynamic speakers around the world to speak in front of well over 500,000 people in an ashram in India, of all
That's
places.
right.
And John, we just kind of took to each other in conversation over dinners there
Yeah.
in Maharashtra in India, and yeah, that's how we met as speakers on a mission to not just have a voice, but give other people a voice, and so incredible, and have been connected ever since.
That's right. And it was such a pleasure to meet you and to have those conversations with you. Cause I'm an old white guy. You're a beautiful black woman. You are not somebody that I probably would have met any other way. I don't know how we would have met,
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to have some really intimate time around dinner with, what was a really amazing group of people,
Yeah.
and to all be committed to going to leave. We were all committed to inspirational messages to be delivered in, the interior of India. And let's talk about that experience for a minute,
Yes.
right? Because that was crazy. I'll tell you one of the reasons that I was so excited to go is because I wanted to share my message about empowering women's voices,
Hmm.
because the basic thing for me is anywhere on earth you measure, on any measure that matters to human beings, anywhere that women are doing better, everything's doing better. The
Hmm.
economy, the environment, children, animals, even men are doing better wherever women are doing better.
Hmm.
And to deliver that to an audience of 500 to
Yeah.
750,000 people was just mind blowing. I mean, that was such a crazy
Crazy.
experience. But I love what the founder of that ashram said. He said, humanity is my religion.
Hmm.
And I personally am not super religious. I know
Hmm.
that you are a woman of faith.
Yeah.
I am, I'm a spiritual guy, but I'm certainly not part of any organized religion.
Hmm.
But I could get behind a religion that, humanity is my religion. I can get behind that.
Hmm.
So tell us about your motivation for going and your message.
Well, number one, my motivation for going is yes, although we have that difference in religious backgrounds, like you, I could get with and support someone who says humanity is my religion and the basis of human goodness and kindness. And to me, that was the
Yeah.
greatest connector. It was important to me because although I do this work locally, when working with women and youth, I knew it was just as important to practice what I preach by building that
Yeah.
bridge globally in
Yes.
person. And what was so transformative about that was although there were language barriers at some point, just when connecting with the people, the biggest connector was humanity, a smile, a look, a
Yeah.
hug, hugging elders. It was no different than sitting with my
Yeah.
own elders. Like it,
Yeah.
yeah, that was why it was important to know that whether black, white, or whatever, there are some things that are highly similar. And I needed to feel that for myself and bring it back home.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah, that was definitely one of the big takeaways again for me is that
mm,
as human beings, no matter where we're from on the planet, no matter what our
mhm.
different backgrounds, how different they may be, we have way more in common with each other
Oh, yeah.
than we don't,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Mhm,
And there's just, so when we're both international speakers, we both
mm,
work with people on speaking. And
yeah,
one of the things I tell people when they say, I want to connect with my audience,
mhm,
I say, well, you've already made one false assumption there when you say that. And they're like, what are you talking about? I say, well, saying I want to connect with my audience assumes that you're not already connected.
yeah.
And you're already connected. Like what you need to
Mhm,
walk out on stage present to is how connected you already are,
mhm,
just because we're human, right?
mhm. That's good, Sean. That's good.
I mean, I think that was our experience over dinner, right?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
very different backgrounds, very different, and I look, we're going to talk about some controversial things today, and I admit that as an older white male in current society,
Mhm,
I sometimes feel like people look at me like I'm the problem and they're not interested in what I have to say. And,
mm,
it's all about diversity and inclusion and equity. And what's a old
mhm,
white guy got to say about that? Right.
mhm,
But over our conversation, you let me know how much it meant to you to have someone like me advocating for you and
mhm,
on your team. And it really freed me up. Like, I got to thank you again. I can't tell you how many times
mhm,
I have played that tape for myself and calmed myself down and gotten present and made a difference
mhm,
because I could play you telling me that,
mhm.
it really made a difference for me.
Well, it was the truth. And
Well,
it
thank you.
was no, seriously, all I did was give you my story and my truth that, yeah, I am a young Black female from the South, from Birmingham, Alabama, and
Yeah.
of all places. So
Of all
there's true,
places. Yeah.
there are a lot of, cultural implications that, albeit I should have some sense of innate fear, generationally, culturally, or whatever,
Right.
but because of um, global experience, corporate experience for 20 years, some of my biggest advocates were white males who affirmed, like, don't change who you are. Your voice is needed at a table to give me a perspective I don't have. And they had
Yeah.
access to rooms and opportunity and privilege and held a door open. And
Yeah.
I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that and say, hey, why would,
Yeah.
like, diversity doesn't mean that your voice doesn't matter. It means that our collective voice is going to solve a problem, not exclusion of
Yeah.
one voice or value of one over another. And I think in that
Yeah.
moment, we gave permission to each other
Yeah.
to
Yeah. Well,
say,
that's great
oh,
to hear.
wow, like, okay, I need you and your perspective, and I need you too, as vastly different as we are, because that's the essence
Yeah.
of diversity.
Yeah.
So,
That is the beauty and the success of diversity
yeah,
is when it's that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That's really cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about communication and
Mhm,
some of the things that you're seeing around communication and
mhm,
leadership in the workplace these days from your perspective. Like when I say that, I mean, it's a pretty broad
mhm.
brush, but what jumps out for you?
The first thing that jumps out for me is I formed a program just out of my own experience in corporate America about
Hmm.
um, when we talk about that. I think self inclusion.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, we put the burden and responsibility on companies, organizations, and entities to make space for me. The problem that I've seen, and I've been a DEI practitioner well before 2020, when it became more trending and adding these roles, and now we've seen some adjustment in that. But
Yep.
as I looked at the lens of it and working with teams across the country, I saw a pattern that as these roles did open up after 2020 for marginalized
Mhm.
groups, that they weren't
Mhm.
fully equipped to have a voice. And so it was like after this fight to make seats or create seats at tables, there's this undoing of a mindset to own your power when you sit in that seat, to know that,
Yeah.
wait, I do have a voice. I may not be like everyone in the room. That's like if I'll use, I am a black female and I predominantly sit at white male tables. If I looked at the table and said I have nothing in common with these men, then I'm self marginalizing and quieting or muting myself. Whereas the
Yeah.
seat was available for me to give a voice to a segment of population that's not represented at the table. So I'm doing a disservice and a deep injustice to myself, even when the door is open, but I'm not equipped in it. So to me, communication is about equipment, being equipped for representation vocally when the opportunity presents itself.
So boy, I hear a lot in that I really like and would
Mhm.
like to talk about
Yeah.
because one of the things that I'm noticing, and it's on both sides of the spectrum
Mhm.
now, like I think it a long time ago, you might have been able to make an argument that it was more of a thing on the left progressive side
Mhm.
versus the right. But I think the right has taken it up with vigor that makes the left look, should be embarrassed about how bad they are at it at this
Mhm.
point. But that whole thing of like not taking responsibility,
Yeah.
right? Like you've got to self-include. Like if you're
Yes.
going to sit over there in
Yes.
the shadows and no one's going to see you and no one's going to know that you even have anything to say or that you want to say, right? That
Mhm.
you're going to make them come get you.
Yeah.
That doesn't work, right? You've got to be there willing to go
Yeah.
and ready to go.
Yeah.
And what I hear in what you're saying is that getting the value of your voice, especially and even though it's different, right?
Mhm.
And being willing to speak up and trust that you are bringing value and go out of your way to be ready to bring value,
Mhm.
right? Do the work that it takes to be a good communicator, do the work that it takes to understand the issues, do
Yeah.
the work that it takes to think critically through these issues instead of just blowing with whatever the wind might be saying at that moment, right?
Mhm.
There's a lot of personal responsibility
Yeah.
in that approach, right? And I think that's really, really important and really missing
Yeah.
on both sides right now.
I like what you said about doing the work of being a good communicator. So I'm going to give you some deeper context if that's okay. So,
Yeah, please.
John, have you ever, you've sat in many of these powerful rooms as well. You're a leader and you
Yeah.
coach and educate leaders, right? Have you sat in a room with your peers or contemporaries and before opening your mouth, have you ever had a moment of of even pausing to think like, I'm afraid that they won't accept my thoughts because they don't look like me? Have you ever had a moment like that?
It's certainly not very often, if ever. Yeah. It is not. No, I'm usually sitting in a room full of people that I feel like
Yeah.
are going to value my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not worried about that. Well, to say doing the work of being a communicator to someone who is marginalized, who
Yes.
has had a generational history of oppressive occurrences, means more
Yeah.
than giving them tools of language. You now have to deal with the emotional and psychological effects of communication in a history of oppressed language.
Yes.
So now, like you said, you've never had to think about that. For anyone marginalized, that's one of the first things they think about. So you
Yeah.
have to teach, coach, and train them differently because of the cultural implications than someone who may be in a majority in a room. It's not the
Right.
same. So, very equal to pedagogy for adaptive learning for kids, where you have
Yeah.
children on a different level. We forget
Yeah.
that adults and the pedagogy of learning development, even coaching on an executive level, still applies because it's like,
Yeah.
wait, all coaching or all communication is not one size fits all. There has to be an
Right.
adaptive method for the women in your organization, for people of color in your organization, or marginalized
Right.
groups who may have to consider things that you've never thought about before they
Right.
speak.
So this is one reason why I just love you is because I feel like you are such a it's going to make me cry. You're
Hmm.
such a big person that you can see past things like unconscious bias
That's absolutely what it is.
and right because and the thing about unconscious bias that I think people sometimes forget when they're battling it is that it is unconscious,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like that's important to remember and to give somebody the opportunity to see what they hadn't seen before and then
Mhm.
maybe have a different opinion and have space for that versus just pillorying them for this unconscious bias that they didn't even know they had, right?
Right.
And what I what it makes me realize is I'm now playing back over all these coaching sessions I've been in with women and people of color and people from other countries and
Mhm.
people for whom English isn't is a second language or a third or fourth language.
Mhm.
Like one of the things that I see in common in all of those coaching sessions is me really pushing for that person to get the value of their opinion
Mhm.
and the importance of their point of view and the importance of what they have to bring,
Mhm.
right? And I'll tell you
Mhm.
a story. So two things. I'm talking a lot here, but two things. Number one, it makes me remember when I was in a course with a woman whom I just love named Allison Armstrong.
Mhm.
And she does a thing called
Mhm.
understanding men. And she said, okay, men, raise your hand if you felt physically threatened in the last week, in the last month,
Mhm.
in the last 6 months, in the last
Mhm.
year, in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, right? Like by the time it was to 10 years, most men had their hand up,
Mhm.
but it took a while,
Mhm.
and then she said, okay, now watch this. Women, raise your hand if you felt physically threatened or insecure in the last day. And most women's hands went up. And then the last week, it didn't get to more than a couple of weeks,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because men don't think about that.
Mhm.
We're generally bigger and stronger,
Yeah.
and we're just, but as a woman, that's a piece of everyday life that men
Mhm.
don't even think about usually.
Mhm.
So, like, and it just go there, like, there's so much more to understand about each other, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then I forgot what the other thing was. I was all excited about it, but I'll remember if it's important.
It'll come back. Yeah. Mhm.
But that kindness that you possess
Ah.
and that willingness to explain, and probably have to explain more than once, and people are probably sometimes slow to get it, and
Mhm.
right.
Mhm.
But my experience of you is that you are willing to do that, and it does remind me of the second thing.
Okay.
Now, this is me, a older white guy, saying this, right? So it's
Okay.
easy for me to say, but I do think that when we talk about safe spaces,
Yeah.
my feeling that I don't think we think about enough, I would say that a safe space is much more about the generosity of the listening than it is about the particular things that get said there.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not defending hate speech or anything,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I think in a typical working environment with what are presumably good people all around mostly,
Mhm.
a safe space is much more a function of how people are listening than what's being said. What do you think of that?
Oh, absolutely. I agree that a safe space is about the listener, because the quality of how you listen determines like it shows, it proves that you've processed and created space for responding and not reacting, which probably
Yeah.
minimizes the likelihood of offense. I'll tell
Yeah.
you why. Because if you're actively listening and not defensively reacting, I
Yeah.
now see that it is safe enough to engage because you haven't cut me off or your body language or demeanor hasn't become uncomfortable and you've made
Yeah.
space to hear me, even if you don't agree with me.
Yeah.
And there's no
Yeah.
safer space than that. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
agree wholeheartedly. Um, I want to go back to even what you're talking about with unconscious bias.
Yeah.
It's unconscious bias is no respecter of person. I don't care who you are, what corner of the world you're in. We all experience it. We all do it. The issue though is how much do you train yourself to be aware of those
Yeah.
biases and minimize microaggressions so that you cut through all of those filters and hear what needs to be heard. That's
Yeah.
always the goal,
Yeah.
right?
So, yes. So tell me a little bit about microaggressions, because I think that it's something that a term people use a lot. People, I think, often a lot of the people that are using it maybe don't fully understand it.
Mhm.
Um, so it gets, so let's talk about that for a minute.
Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about microaggressions.
Microaggressions and unconscious biases are tied together to an extent. It's like a spectrum. Look at it like a
Yeah.
scale because
Yeah.
you'll have like
Yeah.
different types of microaggressions, like micro insults. That's on the high end of the scale. Like I know I'm saying something insulting to you, and I'm like I'm intending to. And then on the scale of like I'm not trying to, and
Right.
the bias is the precursor. It
Yeah.
would be like me saying, "Well, John, you can't relate to me. You're from wherever, Utah, or something." And it's like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, why did you say that? Or, John, you're a white guy.
Yeah.
Shut up. You don't really think about that issue. You're like, wait a minute.
Right.
And for all I know, you could
Yeah.
have spent a stint in your life in like a predominantly black neighborhood. I don't know enough. I don't
Yeah.
know enough. So my bias towards you, see, microaggressions they are visual in the sense that because I'm looking at you and I'm looking at the differences between you and I've now
Yeah.
made an assumption that now translated to my language and how I engage with you.
Yeah.
And it led
Yeah.
with more of an unintentional and sometimes intentional insult that has
Yeah.
now built a barrier where we're attempting to build a bridge,
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point. Puts
right?
up a barrier where we're attempting to build a bridge.
That's really the point of
Yeah.
all of it. We just get it
Yeah.
wrong. But
Yeah. Yeah.
communication, diversity, all of it's supposed to build bridges. And
Yeah.
because of undealt with offenses, unhealed filters and wounds, biases,
Right.
we do that. So yeah,
Yeah.
microaggressions, it's really about calling yourself out, and
Yeah.
also not being mad or offended if someone calls you out on it. I openly
Right.
and you set the rules of engagement. I set the rules of engagement
Yeah.
in every room I go in, whether I'm the speaker, facilitator, or even just a conversation. You and I did that. It's like,
Yeah.
hey, we're going to
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
conversation today. What are the rules of
Yeah.
engagement? Not just for you and I, but for those who are listening in on our conversation. We took
Yeah.
care of that in the beginning. So now
Yeah.
it's safe enough. So if we
Yeah.
can do that as two mature people from different parts of the world, different experiences, companies are nothing but multiplied experiences of what we're doing right now. Set
Yeah.
the rules of engagement to minimize the blow of a microaggression that might happen,
Right.
but we can talk
Yeah.
about it.
Which is so great. I mean, and that's the ultimate thing
Mhm.
for me. Is one of the things that I love about communication is that I genuinely believe anything can be solved in communication
Yes,
if both parties are willing to just keep communicating,
that
right?
part.
And that's I think, that's the hard part. That's the part that takes some work.
Mhm.
So you have done a lot of coaching and
Yeah.
teaching. around DEI,
Yes.
and and before it was the thing,
Yeah.
and so let's, what are, because I've got a lot of listeners here who are small business owners. I've got a lot of listeners here who have their, who are top leaders at big corporations, things
Mhm.
like that. What, what are some of the insights that Melissa D. White has out of your years of
Mhm.
doing this that you think could make a difference for people who are kind of wading through where we are right now with it all?
Mm. Yeah, it's unfortunately DEI has become polarizing. I mean, there are several civil actions. Look at the Fearless Fund and, college admissions, just different things that are affected by not only affirmative action, but just it's become governmental and political. But I think it's important
Yeah.
for leaders at companies to remember that um, don't lean so heavy on the fear of risk mitigation and the legalese of it and not
Yeah.
listen to your people.
Yeah.
Always leave room to hear them and create a channel to hear them and what they need. And when I say people, let me be clear about that. Not just your employees, but your corporate stakeholders and your community stakeholders. I'll give you an example, John, of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So 20 years of my career was in the real estate industry, multifamily and apartment industries and development. So you think about developer, if you're in that business or any business, if you have a brick and mortar business and you're serving a population in a particular community, are you considering the people in house and the
Yeah.
stakeholders of the community around you? So if you're building in an area that may be historically economically impoverished, but they're being gentrified, and your company or your organization coming into that community, what are the implications of that? How do you communicate outside to them about your intentionality, your service offering, and things like that? All of that is a part of the diversity conversation. Let me tell you why. Is, for example, and I've been in a situation, say you have a development team that is predominantly Caucasian, you're building in a minority area. If you don't have a diverse team and someone who knows the area, the people in the population, then there are some cultural norms or community implications that aren't even considered and talked about when you put out your press releases, when you put out news stories, even in your marketing. So it always has a place because your stakeholders and your investors or your employees are not always fairly represented in the rooms where the decisions are made. And that's really what it's about. Like I said, bridges, right? Not barriers. So for me, if I'm going to put out an ad, if I'm going to put up a sign, anything that's a communicator, then the receptor, whoever's receiving it, someone needs to be in the room who understands how it's perceived on the outside and a voice that's really heard and valued. I've seen mishaps happen like that. It's like, hey, you build a building, but the unsaid, the implied bias is, yeah, this building is in your community, but it's not for you.
Right.
So yeah, it's DEI very much has its place. And to be honest with you, all of that for me started in community work. It started outside of my industry. It was work I was doing on a grassroots level with schools and education. And it was like, oh, well, XYZ Corporation is in this district, but there's a lack of resources at this school. And it's like, wait, there's a disconnect here. So I've spent
Yeah.
20 years evaluating disconnects and how DEI efforts are really intended to remedy the disconnect. But it's so unfortunate that we've used it to polarize and drive a bigger wedge.
Yeah. I mean, well, and just just to say it,
Mhm,
we've done that. I think really honestly, we don't talk enough about how much help we've gotten
mhm,
from our adversaries like Russia and China
Mhm.
and Iran and North Korea, who take these things wherever they can and just vastly, vastly amplify them
Mhm.
using the tool we gave them
Yeah.
called social media, you know?
Yeah.
So I think we've fallen prey to that and we've made it worse ourselves.
Mhm.
But I think we need to be really clear that we have gotten a lot, there's been a lot of outside interference trying to politicize and
Yeah.
inflame the divide around
Yes.
DEI,
Yeah,
right?
I agree.
So, so I mean, what I hear in what you're saying is I think pretty obvious on some level, but not nearly obvious enough to a lot of people. Is just that on some level, this is just caring about your stakeholders and maybe slightly broadening your view of who those stakeholders are.
Yes.
I mean, it reminds me of the billboard that some chicken company put up in Mexico. And
Mm.
what they did in the United States was they said it takes a strong man to make a chicken this tender. Ha ha ha, right? Because their chicken was so tender.
Mhm.
But when they put it up in Mexico, they mistranslated it and it said it takes a strong man to make a chicken this amorous. Talk about misunderstanding
Huge
your audience,
misfire.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and this is that just on a lot of different, maybe more subtle levels, right?
Mhm. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just about a diversity hire. It's about it could be a consulting firm. Like, hey,
Yeah.
did we consult with an agency or a representative who could review this before we enter this market? So now having
Yeah.
diverse suppliers would have prevented
Yeah.
that mishap. A PR
Yeah.
agent, a communications team. Like,
Yeah.
that's what diversity is.
Yeah. I mean, it's just understanding your market and your environment
Mhm.
better. Right. I mean, and then there's also plenty of studies that show that more diverse teams produce better decisions,
Mhm. Yeah, that's
right?
irrefutable. I mean, there are
Yeah.
cases for that. But there's a deeper level to diversity though, John.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
There's 7 protected classes. There has been ever since the
Mm-hmm.
Civil Rights Act.
Uh-huh.
And we talk about leadership and living like a leader. And when I personally sit and evaluate myself, like I can talk to other people as speakers, right? We're the first recipient
Yeah.
of our message, hands
Yeah.
down. And I felt this longing. It was like even when we were in India, just to make it full circle, I had to
Yeah.
tie back to what's my personal ethos and
Yeah.
my personal message, and it felt like I'm leaving a part of myself out because of one of those 7 protected classes that is a part of my everyday. It's part of my being, a part of my everyday life, and I felt
Yeah.
I couldn't include in this. Like if I feel this way, I'm sure other people do, and that's faith and religion.
Yeah.
And which is when you talk about polarizing and and that
Yeah.
religion has been politicized. The irony
Yeah.
of that is that we live in the United States of America, and if you know our history, you'll understand why that's highly ironic. Uh,
I mean, this is what we were founded on, is to get away from religious tyranny and the intersection of the mixing of religion and government in a way that didn't allow people to pursue their faith, right?
yeah.
Like that was one of the big driving factors
Hmm.
for founding the United States of America.
Hmm.
And so yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So the full circle moment for me was the boldness to be a Black woman Christian preacher in an ashram in India.
Right.
And, even that moment, that transformative moment of having, a moment of interfaith prayer, regardless of what you
Yeah.
believed, and religious
Yeah.
leaders from around the world, just that recognize that recognition, and
Yeah.
to the connection of Jay Guru, to know like, hey, I see you. I believe,
Yeah.
like, I honor you and you
Yes.
honor me. Like, and it
Yes.
didn't mean I believe in what you believe, but I honor you
Bingo.
and you honor me,
Bingo.
and we can
Yes.
hold space here together for
Yeah.
humanity. And that's what we did. And it was like, now here was the kicker. The hard part was having that moment in India and not being able to come home and have that moment.
Yeah. Boy, oh boy. Yes.
That I
Well,
could have that moment in a culture who was so loving. Oh my gosh, the people were so
yeah,
loving,
it was
regardless of our
phenomenal.
differences.
Yes.
But to go back to organizations and know, like, I don't think they would have received this the same way here that it was there. Do you think so?
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah,
didn't
I
get
mean, no,
that.
no, yeah. No, I
Not here.
definitely think that's one of the issues, right? It was one of the really beautiful things about that ashram. They had a table, you probably remember,
Mhm.
set, and they had a representative from each of the major religions sitting, like
Yep.
a wax figure of them. It was kind of weird, but anyway,
Yeah.
sitting at that table. And then one of the places was open,
Yes.
and that was where your guru could sit.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I was like, whoa, okay,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Right. And they seem to live that, right?
Mhm.
They did an interfaith prayer and they've got that table set and it's a round table, right? There's nobody at the head of that table.
Mhm.
And I thought that was really, really, really cool.
Mhm. I think for me, it from that experience forward in my life, like that was a crossroads, our meeting and
Uh-huh.
then that experience and that conversation
Mm,
where I realized I can no longer separate who I am as a leader from the faith. And it really is not about enforcing or Bible thumping when I go. I mean, I go into companies all the time and I'm there for leadership,
yeah.
but
Right.
in my TED talk, I refer to, hey, there's a hidden conversation that's happening in break rooms and bathrooms and in hallways of people that are connecting on a deeper level around something that we won't touch, and that's faith and beliefs and
Right.
spiritual wellness. I was sharing with you earlier, recently I read an article just yesterday on Harvard Business Review that says 62% of all people affiliate with some religion. 62%, John. That's over
Yeah.
half of the population, vast majority. But yet, it is still nuanced, it's considered high risk. And I understood, like, we had that conversation about, well, it's a matter of, are we enforcing one religion? Is there freedom for all? Is it interfaith? And
Yeah.
although I won't go deep into apologetics or anything like that, I also understand, hey, it would be great if you want to know more about my religion. But I also have to be willing to listen to you too and have an open dialogue. But most people just aren't equipped with the tools. Or
Yeah.
again, the unconscious bias to say, I can have this conversation with you. And we might find that there are some principles or tenets of your faith and mine that allow us to have an equal moral compass and get this job done together.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
statistically
Well,
shown in that same article that it fosters a greater sense of belonging. And I think what was mind blowing to me, I think they said like 8.6% or something like that of the Fortune 100 do have interfaith ERGs. We talked about that, like employee resource
yeah.
groups. And although the diversity conversation is evolving, these employee resource groups are not going away. As a matter of fact, the need for it is accelerating. As a speaker, we're charged to know our industry, and I was reading a trend report for speaking topics in the speaking industry, and they were saying DI is still one of the most popular trending top 5 topics that are in demand around the world, but you're going to see a shift in language where inclusion and belonging are at the top of the list. Well, clearly, there are companies who are demanding it. They just don't know how to do it. So they need
Right.
leaders and coaches and speakers like you and I to facilitate these conversations. Let me glue this all together. If you have a voice, if you are a speaker listening to this or a leader listening to that, to our conversation, it is now you have a fiduciary responsibility to foster belonging through this topic. because it's not going away. As so much so, they said the conversation of inclusion and belonging is up there with the conversations about AI.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. I
yeah.
could easily believe that. I mean, we definitely, I think, are having a crisis of belonging in this country.
Hmm.
You know, I could easily see that. And I think that what I'm hearing because I grew up Mormon and that's a pretty strict religion,
Yeah.
and I decided uh in my like at about 20 that I didn't want to be a part of organized religions. And so for a while I was really really like I was really anti.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I got a little older, I started to see the upsides of my upbringing, and I started to be really proud of my Mormon heritage, and I'm just not Mormon. And I think that that experience at the ashram is something to really keep coming back to, right? Like, how could we create not my religion dominates your religion,
Mm-hmm.
but how could we create a round table where people of various faiths and even people who are, you know, purposefully not faith based, how could we create a round table where all those people can have a conversation and belong,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that I'm really interested in what everybody agrees on, right?
Yes.
Like, if everybody says love your neighbor, okay, that's cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the minute somebody says I'm right, you're wrong, like, then I start to get less interested, right?
Mm-hmm.
But talking about what we all have in common and what we all think are meaningful principles and values, I think that's an ongoing, valuable conversation.
Mm-hmm.
If we can create that space where we respect each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it really is it's another aspect of diversity, equity, and maybe belonging,
Mm-hmm. It
right?
absolutely fosters a greater sense of belonging. You brought up values, and this is
Yeah.
why it's important to your listening leaders, uh, because we look at um, generational um, retention, recruitment, all of that. I was looking at some stats preparing for a speaking engagement in 2 weeks, and it was looking at, okay, what is Gen Z looking for as hiring, requirements for employment,
Yeah.
and at the top of their list, it's the value shared value system. But if I just said, remember I said 62% of people have a religious affiliation. Out of that 62%, like you said, is there a value system of the faith that equals the value system of your company? Like you said, core tenets:
Hmm.
kindness, unity,
Yeah.
compassion, respect, whatever. Um,
Yeah.
so if this generation is looking for companies that align with that, that's directly tied to the retention,
Yeah.
the hiring practice, and the onboarding of your company and your employees. That's the number
Yeah.
one reason you should care about anything that we're talking about right now. If
Yeah.
for no
Right.
other
Right.
reason, forget if you don't agree with my politics or my religion or whatever. We do agree that having a core value system that's properly articulated and connecting with people
Yeah.
to work for you is
Yeah.
top of mind. It has to be. And so
Yeah.
again, there's space for it, and we have to be the culture carriers, and it's leaders like you and I and your listeners who are not responsible to set the pace for that. We have to.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Well, so Melissa, I know it's a little bit past
Yeah.
the time I said I'd get you out of here. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you want to say before we go? Like anything to wrap it up?
I'm just so excited to give people a voice. I'm working on some new things. through working
You've
with marginalized groups about how to activate your voice and empower yourself. There's studies on what empowerment really means, and leaders talk
mhm.
about empowerment. I want to empower you to be seen. I want to empower you to be heard. When it's really people empowering themselves, you have to create space for
Yeah.
them to tap into that power. You can't enable you can tell someone, "Hey John, you're powerful," but until John empowers
Yeah, gets it
himself
himself. Yeah.
with again with your own sense of belonging and identity and all of that. So I'm really excited about those things coming this year, and
Yeah.
that work around empowering yourself, and that book at the end of the year. And then still in the
Yeah,
coaching
yeah, you're
space.
so you're writing a book
I
that's
am.
gonna come out at the end of the year,
Yeah.
and people can probably follow along at
Yes, you can
melissa.dwight.com.
absolutely
You'll
not only follow the journey. I mean, there's some focus groups we're doing around the book and several conferences. And if you are interested, I invite you. We can have a conversation about interfaith and faith at work. Of course, my TED
uh,
Talk is there, as well
y
as
y
books and materials
we'll put a
around.
link to your TED Talk.
Yeah, all of it's linked to my TED Talk and on melissa.dwight.com around the spirit led leader. If you choose that path of like, hey, what are some things I can do to have more inclusive organizations and foster belonging in that way? So, yeah, just go to
Yeah,
melissa.dwight.com and learn more.
fabulous.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we finally did this.
Thank you, John. I'm
Thank you for
honored.
joining me.
Thank you for having
Likewise,
me.
my pleasure. And thank you for joining us today on Live Like a Leader show. And I will look forward to hearing you next time. Take care. Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.